It's Tuesday, February 28th, 2023. My name is Ashton Ellett, here with another installment of the Russell Oral History documentary series sponsored by the Richard B. Russell Library for Political Research and Studies at the University of Georgia. I'm here today in Washington, D.C. with Miss Janice Mays. A Georgia native, she earned her bachelor's degree from Wesleyan College in Macon, Georgia, her J.D. from the University of Georgia, and an LL.M. from Georgetown University. She spent more than 4 decades working on Capitol Hill, which included more than 2 decades as Democratic Chief Counsel and Staff Director for the powerful House Ways and Means Committee, where she oversaw issues like tax policy, healthcare reform, and international trade. In fact, she was the first woman to lead a major committee staff in the House of Representatives. Ms. Mays is now Managing Director of PricewaterhouseCoopers Washington National Tax Service here in D.C. Ms. Mays, Janice, thank you so much for taking some time this afternoon to tell us about your life in and out of government service here in Washington.
Thanks for inviting me.
We love to have you here, and thanks also, I should add, to Randy Knuckles and everybody here at the Denton's Washington, D.C. office for graciously hosting us. So I wonder, can we begin by telling us a little bit about your childhood and your upbringing in Georgia? Where'd you grow up?
I grew up in Ware County, Georgia.
The largest county in
The
Georgia.
largest county and the largest state east of the Mississippi.
That is
We
correct.
were always very proud of that. But I lived out in the country. My grandparents had purchased from an original Revolutionary War land grant owner a 644-acre plot, and my grandmother had inherited some of it. Mm-hmm. And so I was raised there by my mother and father, and I had an older sister, 2.5 years older, and grew up in Ware County. Went to Ware County High School, Waresboro Elementary School, and loved it. It was a great place to go up. I was the outside kid. My sister was the inside kid. So I was kind of the tomboy in the family, just us 2 girls. And in the 8th grade, I decided I was tired of working in tobacco. So in the summers, we had tobacco in the family. We only had a 1/4 acre plot that my uncle did, but tobacco was a big product back then. And I would work in my uncle's area handing. I never got better than just handing tobacco, but I wanted to go to summer school instead and took algebra to start high school early, and that led me on a good path to when I finished high school, want to go to college. Ware County wasn't really focused on sending kids to college. You really stayed in Waycross and worked in Waycross in the agribusiness or in the city itself. It's a town that had union shops back then, and so there was work to be had. But I wanted other things, and both my parents had been college graduates. So I started that, and I really loved growing up. I was involved in 4-H. I was involved in everything in high school. My whole life, I've never been in one clique. They think I was in every group of some kind.
You were a joiner.
Theater, I was a joiner, absolutely, and loved every minute of it. Loved it all. Went off to Wesleyan College in Macon, where my sister had gone. I'd planned my entire life to go to Georgia Tech and become an architect. But when I was a senior in high school, 5 years of school to get that college degree scared me away a little bit. So I went to Wesleyan thinking I would be a math major.
Sure.
I'd done so well at Ware County. Well, freshman math did me in, so I was not a math major. I had to find something else to do, and became a political science major.
That's a pretty
it was a big
stark
it was
contrast.
Different. I had the most wonderful civics professor and history professor in high school. And so it was something I had loved. And as we'll learn, there was some family lore too. We'll learn later in this interview. But so I just enjoyed that, and I enjoyed the policy making aspect of things more than really the politics and the world kind of view of those things. So I was the only political science major at Wesleyan, so I had lots of independent studies of different kinds, including working in the state capitol as an intern for 3 months as kind of an interim project thing that was an independent study for my major. And in college, I had the opposite reaction that I had had in high school. It was like, oh my God, I have to get a job. My father had wanted me to get a teaching certificate. And with a political science major, you either need a graduate degree or a teaching certificate, basically. There's no role for you in any other world.
No.
But I was impractical. These were still I was a bit of a hippie in college, marching in anti-war marches and all sorts of things. But I decided maybe law school was the thing for me.
Okay.
So I applied to Georgia and got in. I wasn't the first class of women. We were maybe a third of the students of that freshman of that first year class at Georgia. But it was a great next experience for me. So that was my growing up.
Now, did your love of math ever carry over, or was that something that you just had to put into a box and leave behind when you became a political science major and a
Simple
law
math
student?
I still love. I still do my tax return by hand if I'm allowed. I still, I seldom take my phone out to do addition, subtraction, multiplication, but you get into those complex things.
Yeah,
and
the area
I've
underneath
left
the curve.
them behind, and they've left me behind.
Okay, so you mentioned some family lore, and I know it because we talked a little bit before we turned the camera on, but you are related to the Talmadge family.
I am.
Tell us how exactly.
I am. It sounds more convoluted than it really is. But my father's mother was a Thurman. And Eugene Talmadge's wife was Mitt Thurman. And my grandmother was Willie Mae Thurman, her younger sister. And Willie Mae died in childbirth with my father. He had an older sister. She was told never to have another child, and she wanted another child, so she had one, and she died, and he was kept in a shoebox in the fireplace. That was his incubator because he was born early.
Oh, wow.
As she died, and his father remarried shortly thereafter, and the mother wanted to have her own children. She didn't want these two children from his first marriage. And so he was raised by his Thurman grandparents till he was 13. Both of them died. They lived in northern Florida at the time. And Miss Mitt and Uncle Eugene took them in when he was governor, and they lived there. Daddy's teenage years up to his young 20s were spent living in the state capitol. He always told me his chore was to milk the goat that lived on the lawn of the capitol at that point.
This would have been the old governor's mansion.
This was the old governor's mansion.
Prado, is that what it was called?
I do not even know its name. Daddy was reticent to tell as many stories as I would have loved.
I think it's the Prado. I'm pretty sure.
But I think of it as an old red brick.
Right.
Kind of a
it was a prettier building than the new one.
Almost, yeah. And so he was raised there. When Uncle Eugene died, Daddy was in medical school. Herman was in law school. They were maybe a year apart in age. And Daddy quit medical school and went to work down in South Georgia at the State Health Department as a health representative. That was his career. And I had always feared it was because he didn't want to borrow money from Herman, whereas Uncle Eugene paid for it. But he said he didn't really love medical school, and so he was kind of happy to be done with it. Not clear it was his ambition to be a doctor at that point. So went down, worked at the State Health Department, met my mother, who was in an interlude, having been at the University of Georgia and left at one point when probably her first love had died in the war.
Oh.
And so Daddy courted her until she accepted. And later on in life, she went back and got her degree and several graduate degrees from Georgia Southern, became a teacher, a counselor, and lots of other things in the education field, and was very renowned down in Southeast Georgia in that world. But I grew up in a family that revered education. Living out in the country of South Georgia, I was very lucky. So both my sister and I went on to college and graduate schools of different kinds. But it was interesting. We would go and visit the Talmadges once in a while. I think I inherited Daddy's reticence to bother people. I'll be in the way. They don't need to spend their time with me. In hindsight, enjoy your family, get to know them well. Sharing time with people is one of the best things you can do. Mm-hmm. But I didn't do as much of that. But yeah, it was great.
So he wasn't, and obviously I don't want you to necessarily put words in your late father's mouth, but it wasn't that he had negative experiences with growing up with the Talmadges. It was just...
Oh, he loved it.
Okay.
He loved it. When he would tell stories about it, he would love it. He loved Miss Mitt. He loved Herman. When he would come and visit me in Washington, he'd make a special point of going over and visiting Senator Talmadge. But he just, it's they don't need to take time for me kind of a guy.
Gotcha.
That's who he was. He would come and visit me and just want to sit at home and just show me he loved me by being close by. That's just the kind of
that was
the
his
guy
love
he was.
language.
It took him a
speak.
long time to even learn to say I love you. It was a hard scrabble start in life.
Sure.
And he was just kind of closed because of some of that.
I can completely understand why after hearing that story. So in law school, did you have a sense of that you wanted to what kind of practice you wanted to be in? Or is it one of those things like so many folks, they go to law school or graduate school because they don't know what to do yet?
Some of it was not knowing, but as you've learned by now from this filming, I don't tend to have a 5 or 10 year plan. I tend to the big fingers of fate somehow points me in a way, and it's been great.
Sure.
I have loved it, haven't regretted it, but I did think about it in law school, and I spent time deciding as much what I didn't want to do. Sure. I think my expectation was I would go back to Waycross, Georgia and hang out a shingle. But I didn't want to do that right away.
Okay.
So could I do something in the interim? Maybe the postponement of reality was still my story. It was my story certainly after college, and so maybe it was still after law school. So I did start looking around and decided I had loved my time in Atlanta at the state capitol. Mm-hmm. I'd worked on the Ag Committee, just as an intern, but I'd worked on the Ag Committee and I think on the Financial Services Committee. I thought it was wonderful. I thought the process was wonderful. I thought getting your picture made with the governor was wonderful. The whole thing it just brought me joy. So when I was thinking about what I wanted to do, among the things that came to my mind were going up and working for the Congress. Now, what I thought that meant was working in a member or senator's personal office as a legislative aide.
Sure.
Kind of learning a portfolio of subjects and dealing with those subjects. And I applied to every senator and congressman from Georgia. Remember, this was 1975, and Democrats were in charge most everywhere in Georgia at that point. So I applied to all those offices. Didn't even think about it being Democrat or Republican, but Democrats were in charge. And so who are you kind of looking at but those guys? And nobody had an opening. And I happened to be in my law school class with Susan Landrum, daughter of longtime North Georgia Congressman Phil Landrum. Mm-hmm. And Susan said to me, well, if you're having trouble, you should talk to my daddy. And, and it was smart advice. And she gave me some other advice. Here's kind of, he's not going to love you if you're super liberal. I know you have that in your background. So that's not who you
didn't talk about your Wesleyan days.
No, did not talk about marching and marches. But, she said, but I think he might be able to help you. It was still a world of patronage on Capitol Hill.
Sure.
And if you remember, this was right after Watergate. The Ways and Means Committee had expanded. It was, tax it had only been 25 Democrats before, 25 members before this, and the committee had served as the Democratic Committee on Committees. It got to decide what committees other Democrats sat on. It was this all-powerful thing. And after Wilbur Mills was deposed, after Watergate, and all the new Democratic freshmen came piling in, and they wanted change.
The Watergate babies.
The Watergate babies. Well, I was kind of a bit of that myself as I came in at the end of 75. But they made lots of changes, and most of those changes were not to just hoard power in the very senior members, but to find a way for people to find places to express themselves, things to be in charge of when they're younger. Well, Ways and Means got expanded, and the staff consequently got expanded. So they had an opening on the tax staff. Now, had I thought about doing tax? No. Had I enjoyed tax in law school? Yes. I'd had a kind of a good time doing that. So, I wasn't probably your most ambitious technical tax person, but I have a good gut sense, and I understood the tax thing. So I applied for that. And my interview on Capitol Hill, I went up, and the new chairman of the committee was Al Ullman. And the Ways and Means Committee still today has a small room off the House floor that has a big conference table, a little bigger than this, that is its meeting room. Now, the committee's gotten so big, it's hard for the committee to meet in there.
Sure.
But back then, they would hold conferences with the Senate there on legislation, and they would meet there. And it's perfect because then you could just run over and vote on the floor and come right back. Takes you 2 seconds. And so my interview was there, and the ceiling had just been painted. If you're not a person who's visited the Capitol often, the ceilings and the walls and all, it's like a castle in another country. It's our version of that with our history painted. And the little room, that's the Ways and Means room, had been used originally as the Armed Services Committee room. So it was a saddle and some arrows and some ammunition, some different things represent armed services, but it was really pretty. And my boss, Al Ullman, had been a real estate agent. And he loved the room. And we discussed the ceiling painting. That was my interview. It wasn't how much tax do you know. It was, Phil Landrum's told me you're good at that. You're in law school with his daughter, so I know that. But let's find out if you're a human being and I would enjoy working with you.
Sure.
Do you speak English simply and clearly and just whatever it was that he thought he wanted at the time. And somehow I passed. And I believe that in that context, I think Daddy had probably told Senator Talmadge, but Senator Talmadge sent a good word in for me, which actually helped at that point. And one of the people who kind of were the all-purpose people, Walter Little, who'd been Wilbur Mills' all-purpose person, was sitting outside, he and Hulan Green, with these 2 wonderful black gentlemen who cared for the committee. They took care of all of us and the committee itself, the committee room, etc. And I remember walking to my interview, and Walter Little said to me, "It's going to be okay. Senator Talmadge sent a good word in." so it was that, and I was hired. So I went up in December of '75. So I was a little before Jimmy Carter, not much, but just a little before, and started working. And you have assignments the first day. You're not. They need you to be working on things. And so you do. As a young person, you kind of build your portfolio. But you start, the tax staff was, at that point, 3 people, and 4 people a little bit later. And we did all of the tax work for the committee. It was just a grand experience. I stayed a long time because I loved it all.
So one clarifying question. You worked for the staff itself. You were not Phil Landrum's staffer.
Nope, I was not hired by Phil Landrum. He didn't have space. He had said no to me.
Okay.
So the committee hired me.
Okay.
And I started as a tax counsel at the committee, and I stayed at the committee all my years. Most people aren't lucky enough to have one job that continues for that long, because you are there at the whim of the chair or whatever.
Right.
But fortunately, they thought I added value.
Yeah.
So when we got a new chair, a new Democratic chair, in 1981, he kept me on, and then I was kind of moved up to be there was a subcommittee that dealt with tax, so I became that staff director of that subcommittee.
Okay.
Then I moved up to be the chief tax counsel, and then later, toward the end of his tenure, I moved up to be the chief counsel of the committee.
Right.
And there you're dealing with Social Security and Medicare and trade and unemployment compensation and all of those things that the committee encompasses in addition to tax, and have all different kinds of things. And so I was that, and then he lost in the '94 election, as you've said earlier, the Newt Gingrich wave at that point, and the decision had to be made. We had to shrink our staff. Did I stay or did I go? But that was left up to me. The person who was coming in to take his place as a Democrat wanted me to stay, but the Republicans were going to be in charge.
Sure.
And they didn't want me to be their chief counsel. I'd been it for the Democrats. So they wanted kind of a clean slate. So I moved over and became the chief counsel for the Democrats. In the minority, I'd be just for them. Whenever they would get power again, I'd go back and be it for the committee.
Now, did you identify, and I want to go back and ask about what it means to work on tax policy just sitting in the staff, the committee staff. But did you yourself identify as I'm a civil servant, in British speak, you're a Whitehall civil servant, or did you identify as a Democrat working on the committee as a Democrat?
Originally, it was the former. It was pure civil servant.
Right.
The committee was pretty bipartisan. Excuse me.
Sure.
And worked together on things. The way Wilbur Mills had run the committee, he wouldn't rush issues. So by the time you would deal with Medicare, it was pretty much a positive thing. People wanted to get it done. Mm-hmm. And he would work, there's a staff called the Joint Committee on Taxation staff. The Joint Committee itself is just the very senior Democrats and Republicans on Ways and Means and Senate Finance.
Right.
But the staff is brought in. It has a purpose under the Internal Revenue Code where it reviews huge refunds for corporations. But on the Hill, its purpose was the House and Senate didn't have to learn everything separately. They were a common staff of technicians that would help you, the things you learned putting a bill together in the House, the Senate would benefit from that too. And their staff estimates the revenue consequences of tax policy. So they kind of have a three-part thing that they do. But Wilbur Mills and Russell Long, who was his long-term chair of the Senate Finance Committee at the time, would get together with the chief economist who was running the Joint Committee at the time, Larry Woodworth, and they would decide what went into legislation. And they'd put something in here for you, and something in here for you, and something in here for you. And generally, they talked with you, the other members, you knew what was wanted, but it ended up being kind of a get along, go along world that was then changing with these new Democrats who'd come in, a new chair. And so it had to evolve at that point into something. But I was just working on tax policy. I, like most people, thought tax policy was just to raise money. That was its purpose. But you work on these committees and you learn it is used as a social change thing in many ways. And over the last 10 to 20 to 30 years, it's been more so. Back then, my very first day on the job, the committee, the Ways and Means Committee and Senate Finance Committee were in conference in that little room that I'd interviewed in, giving back money to taxpayers. The tax code had not been indexed. The brackets had stayed the same, and as your income went up because of inflation, you paid more.
Bracket creep.
So it was absolutely bracket creep, and this was basically the Tax Gift Act, Tax Cut Act of 1975. And I thought, I could do this. We're going to be giving away money. That's our job to do this. But those social policies, you'd come to learn several things. One, with other budget restrictions on appropriations and other things, and not able to start new entitlements, you look at the tax code. You want to encourage business to invest. You want to encourage whatever, and you do it through the tax code.
Right.
It's kind of a big hammer, and sometimes you need a little pin to do it instead, but it is that. So I learned a lot when I was there. You mentioned I got my master's in tax at Georgetown. Partly that was to have the discipline of a lot of that other tax world, because you spent 5 minutes on this issue and 5 minutes on that issue and 5 minutes on this issue, much of the time up there. But later on, I would say after '94, when the Republicans kind of took their own direction on things, I began to see that my goals and their goals were different. I was still just staff, you're not trying to do your own goals up there as staff, but I'm a Democrat at heart. That's who I am, and I can't change that. But up until that point, I'd never really had to stop and think about it.
Sure. So I'm thinking about, you're talking major policy, and you talk about 1975 and this gift act and giving away money, jokingly, but 1981, there's a new Democratic Ways and Means chair, Dan Rostenkowski, and there's a new Republican president, Ronald Reagan, who ran on reforming the tax code, and that's what they set about doing. Tell me about that 1981. There's two. Obviously, there was two tax bills, actually, 1 and 2. Tell me about working on those and what it was like as a Democrat, as a Democratic staffer working on a Republican president's priority.
It was interesting. In many ways, the reform of the tax code was a joint priority. It just happened to merge.
Okay.
It might not have. But when Ronald Reagan was an actor, rates were at least 70%.
Sure.
It was really high, and he remembered that.
Right.
And hated it. It may have even been 90% at one point.
At one point, it got to 91.
And he despised that. So, but Rostenkowski had the same view of we should broaden the base and lower the rates. Now for Rostenkowski, some of that would be, this was really the beginning of taking the lower income taxpayers off the tax rolls altogether.
Right.
So it was a process. They came at it from different directions. But Rostenkowski loved his presidents. He'd gone to military school. George Bush one had served on the committee. They were great friends on the committee. There was, Capitol Hill. All this stuff merges, and your relationships are the things that help you do what you do up there. But he loved Ronald Reagan. He wasn't close to him like he was George Bush, but he went up to the White House, and they had a conversation and found a commonality there about doing this tax reform that was about, those of you that it's a long time ago, but in the end, I think the thing that Democrats and maybe Reagan too were the proudest of, it didn't stick long with Republicans when George Bush came in, but the thing they were proudest of was it equalized what your earned income, what you got by going out and working and being paid there, with your investment income. You paid the same rate on everything. Your capital gains, your dividends, you paid the same rate. And so one wasn't favored over the other. Like I said, that lasted about a year. But that was one of the pieces of the package. But lower rates generally were part of the package. Getting rid of you had to get rid of a lot of special things. Now, I've moved on to the 86 Act. Let me go back to 81. That's the consequence of this. But 81, Reagan had just come in. They didn't know each other yet. Treat that first little part as a segue I'm going to get to later. But he hadn't come in yet, and Reagan wanted to just do tax cuts at that point. That was just about tax cuts. Democrats weren't necessarily smart about tax cuts. But there were some Democrats who wanted to do tax cuts too. And Rosti was a new chair. He wanted to lead his committee. He wanted to be successful at the end. And what success meant in that context was, I think people would describe it these days, if you go back and read Gucci Gulch and some of the books that were written about some of these things, people describe the 81 bill, the bill that led to all these other things, as a bidding war between Republicans and Democrats. And Democrats can never outbid Republicans on tax cuts. It was a lesson that, it was one of the first lessons, but it was a lesson that needed to be learned. And so the Republicans and Reagan would propose one thing, and Democrats would propose a little more, and then a little more, and a little more, and a little more, and a little more. And in the end, that passed, and it was really big, but it caused lots of issues in the economy. The deficit started growing. In the real estate world, tax shelters became the thing because you had so much depreciation and so much that one could get the tax benefits out of it that it was hard for somebody to just buy a regular home, and for yourself. And there was just all this competition in the real estate world, and there were other areas like that. But Reagan's economic team, David Stockman, Richard Darman, both Donald Regan and James Baker, who kind of traded chief of
roles.
staff and Treasury Secretary roles, all realized that they'd done too much. And so one of the things I think most people don't know about Ronald Reagan is they came up and worked together with the Hill to try to do, in 82, you had what was called a reconciliation bill, a budget reconciliation bill, to try to take some of that back and make the deficit better.
Right.
83, you had another. And it was hard because giving away money was so much easier than taking back the money. That first year in 82, the Ways and Means Committee couldn't get a bill out. Couldn't get enough Democrats to vote for it. You know, Republicans want to vote for undoing these tax cuts. Couldn't get enough Democrats to vote for it to get it out. So there had been a little bill that had passed that dealt with the excise tax on bows and arrows that had gone over to the Senate. So it passed out. So the Senate had a revenue measure. And you have to remember the Constitution says revenue measures originate in the House. So Bob Dole, chairman of the Senate Finance Committee at the time, took that little bill and added the big reconciliation tax bill to it. It went all the way to the Supreme Court to determine if it was a revenue measure. And it was, even though it was very small, it was a revenue measure. So it passed muster. And then in conference, Ways and Means and Senate Finance worked out the details of a bill that began to take back some of that excess of 81.
Right.
83, similar. I think we got through committee but couldn't get through the floor at that point. So the Senate bailed out again and you kind of moved. So by the time you'd gotten through 2 or 3 of these reconciliation bills, people had their calluses. They'd kind of been hoeing in the garden at that point and knew what they were doing and were willing to vote for tough things. So in 85, you began the Tax Reform Act work in the House. And those Democrats were willing, it died 1,000 deaths from the banking industry or this industry or that industry. But in the end, they realized it was something they wanted to do. But if you hadn't had 81 and you hadn't had the trust that was built between President Reagan's group of leaders that were working for him and the Hill, and Republicans and Democrats together as staffs on the Hill, the Joint Committee on Taxation, the trust that you don't have today among all these groups. You had that in a bipartisan way. The Senate was run by this point, it was Bob Packwood at the Senate Finance Committee when we were dealing with the 86 Tax Act. But all of that allowed that group to work together to find some tough answers that weren't necessarily about raising more revenue. They'd done that the last few years, but making the system work better. That was more convoluted than I meant it to be.
No. Because I think the perception amongst, and by some I mean usually talking heads, the punditry, the chattering class, is that it's wrapped in this nostalgia, this sentimentalism of, oh, Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill, they had this personal relationship, this bond. And what you're saying is it was about relationships and the shared experience of hard work, but it was among those staffs and those committees that were going to have to do the work. Reagan
was not a technician, didn't want to be, but was a great manager. He let his people, if they're doing a good job, just do it. Right. Great manager. Tip O'Neill, unlike today's Congress, he did not try to centralize all the power at leadership. The committees got to decide what they were doing. It's a completely different world up there today.
Yeah, and we can talk about those sort of post-94.
But Tip O'Neill, but both of them, what they did, Rostenkowski said to the president, you're not going to like this along the way, but give us to the end. Don't say bad things about the pieces you don't like along the way. It's a process.
Ignore the process, focus
let
on
the process
product.
work, and in the end, you're going to be happy, and he was. And he let that happen. And Tip O'Neill the same way. He let them have their head and go off and do these things.
So let's talk about that process of and the different pieces of that 86 Reform Act. It's talking about saving Social Security and doing all of these things. How did the bill start out, and what came out on the other end, and what happened in here, the thing that President Reagan wasn't supposed to focus on?
It started in early '85. I think first there was a presidential speech. I don't think this was a State of the Union speech. I think it was especially on tax reform. President Reagan went on national TV, and Rostenkowski gave the answer that night. And that's when he said, just write Rosti, Washington, D.C. And we got all these, it was long before you had emails and things.
Sure.
So we got these butter-stained letters from people about things. We also got mass mailings from people, but we got things about what people cared about there. But that was the beginning, and we had, I think, 57 hearings. We had lots of hearings. We had lots of things that in the back room, the committee was divided. There were, in the beginning, it was Republicans and Democrats. Toward the end, it was 2 Republicans and the Democrats. But one group would work on banking taxes, and one group would work on real estate taxes. One group would work on international taxes. And they would sit down and really learn about it. And then the staff would give them options and explain the options and explain the revenue consequences. And those members would evolve with the thing. When I was thinking about one of the deaths, at one point the banking group was meeting in this back room. Now the lobbyists were out in the hall. That's why it was called Gucci Gulch, because a lot of them were wearing Gucci loafers. But they were outside. They weren't in for these
That's so
meetings.
1980s.
It is.
I mean, just...
We also had a phone booths out there back that they would use. But you're doing that, and at one point, the members were considering what to do with certain bad debt reserves for banks. I think it was the bad debt reserves, and they voted to do something weaker than had been proposed. And somebody went out in the hall and told the lobbyist, and you could hear the members still, and the staff still sitting in the room could hear we won. And the chairman declared tax reform dead that night, because without this particular rule, it all didn't work.
What is the bad? Assume I'm not a tax specialist. What is bad debt?
Bad debt is debt you're going to have to, you expect to have to write off.
You're going to have to write it off.
Because nobody's going to pay it back to you.
I see.
So
okay,
that's all
it's much simpler than I was imagining.
And the question is, when do you write it off, and how much can you write it off, et cetera.
Yeah,
so this was kind of a not letting you do as much of the tax write-off for it.
Okay.
And so Rostenkowski declared the bill dead. And the next day, those members who had voted for the more lenient thing came to the chair and said, we think tax reform is important enough that let's go back and redo this. And there was kind of that over and over again. It was one of those bills that for those members who worked on it, it was a lifelong bonding experience for having done something together that was bigger than you were. We don't get a lot of those these days.
This seems like such a foreign concept to anybody who's watched or experienced the Congress over the past 2 decades or so.
Yeah.
Maybe more.
Probably one of the reasons I'm not up there anymore.
Fair enough.
But it is what it is. So it started with those hearings and those meetings they're having to read a lot. The staff, one of the things the staff does is putting together documents for them to read and past histories and here's what it is now, and here are your choices for going forward. Here's why this might simplify. Here's why this might be too generous. Here's why we may need to make this more generous at this point. So those members are taking that all in. And then those things they end up deciding in that conference room, they still have to deal with in public.
Right.
They still have to go to the committee. The committee has to have a markup. And that markup starts with what we call a chairman's mark, which is, at that point in time, didn't have to be statutory language, but it's at least a sheet of specifications of what the rules will be. Starting a little later, it ended up, now they have to mark up from the legislative language. They always had to, when they started with these specifications, they had to come back and approve the language itself, but they would start with that concept. And then the staff would go off and draft those concepts and put it into legislation. And you'd kind of take one piece at a time, and people would, if something was germane to that topic, you're offering your amendments and you're voting on them in the committee, and you're building up. And Then you're ready to report that bill out. This would have been the end of 85. And you take it to the floor. Now, we didn't have the votes to pass it on the floor right away. We had to go back and change a few things to get it through the Rules Committee to the floor so that it could be dealt with in the floor. And then the Senate took most of 86 to do its own version of that.
Right, in the Finance Committee.
In the Finance Committee. And they also didn't have the votes at the beginning. Bob Packwood changed a lot of things. He changed kind of the rate structure for individuals. And there were some pretty major things he changed. And then the Senate Finance did its bill this same way, got it through the Senate. Then you had a conference, and the conference took a number of days. It wasn't kind of an hour conference. Today, sometimes a conference is just the photo opportunity. And then, they do things behind the scenes and come back and approve it or whatever, or just sign it on the floor, don't even actually come back. But this was a real conference, and they're debating these different things, and they resolved it, and finally, in October of 86, it finally got done, and it was just something they were very proud of.
Were there amendments offered on the floor, or was it
no,
what came out of that conference?
If you needed to do an amendment to get the votes, the Rules Committee in the House would incorporate that amendment in the bill as though it had come to the committee that way.
I see.
You generally don't open up the tax code for amendments on the floor, so it's just it's a tradition more than an absolute rule. But
right. So what we just heard is what would be considered regular order of how bills
it was very much
were drafted and amended.
Well, and even in 84 we were working toward it. It took a long time to do it, but it was one of those times where many a month I forgot to pay my mortgage. I bought new underwear because I didn't have time to wash underwear. It was one of those worlds of you're living on your.
You may have been evicted, but you had clean underwear.
I did.
That's the important.
I had my priorities.
So, how did the 86 tax bill reform taxation as Americans would feel and know and understand in their daily lives?
It lowered their tax rates. We had already begun to index the code, so it may have fine-tuned that some, but we didn't. 6 million taxpayers who had been taxpayers didn't have to pay tax anymore.
And those were lower income.
The lower income taxpayers didn't have to pay tax anymore. It started some new concepts for the earned income tax, right? For some things that would help those lower income taxpayers. It still took away a number of tax breaks but for individuals, big business paid for them to have a tax cut. So they viewed it more like a tax cut, I would say. Simplified, there were lots of things in many ways, like the 2017 legislation, got rid of some itemized deductions, some things like that. This did the same thing.
Okay.
So that you could lower those rates, but it also took like $10 billion from international business to help on this side of the ledger at that point, which is not what 2017 did.
Right.
So there were some differences like that, but for most taxpayers, they would notice a smaller tax the next year. Most of the decisions were, there were lots of things. How could tax-exempt bonds be used? How could, what depreciation schedules would be? There were things, but more of those big changes that were tougher were on the business side than on the individual side.
Or Social Security taxes and how
that was not really in this bill.
Okay.
That was 1993.
Oh, okay. Is that the Omnibus Reconciliation Act of 93?
It may have been no, it wouldn't have been in that. You can't do Social Security in reconciliation.
Okay.
It was a separate bill. I think it finally was finished about on a Monday, and then that Friday the checks wouldn't have been whole. But you had Jake Pickle on Ways and Means, who was the Social Security Subcommittee Chair, Rostenkowski on Ways and Means. You had the Senate guys, and like most things, it had left itself to the end to be done, and they finally found a compromise that did a little bit of lots of different things, but gave it long-term solvency in a big way. But it was one of those times when Republicans and Democrats also held hands and did the thing. It was the third rail, but Bob Dole was very involved in that, and he was he was irascible in many ways, had a great sense of humor, but it was very tough and dry. But he wanted to do things that were right for the country. He was, all of them did. That's why they went there.
So after '86, did you and everybody on the staff take a long vacation? Or what? Because this is in a way generational legislation.
We slept for 2 or 3 days, but you don't get to stop altogether. You've still got the business of the Congress, the kind of end of year business that year, and there's always something new. And when the first George Bush came into office,
right.
Republicans very much wanted those capital gains rates to go back down.
Sure.
And so that sort of started the changes in the '86 Act. That peace didn't last super long at that point.
Had you, because historically speaking, when we're painting with broad strokes right now, Republicans very concerned about deficits, budget deficits, as opposed to low taxes or tax cuts. During your time in the House, did you see that sort of mentality shift? How so? Was this sort of...
You're going to find my bias in this answer.
That's
okay,
and that's
so let
perfectly
me just
fine.
announce
That
is
up front,
my inherent
fine.
bias. Each side cares about deficits in different ways. But for Republicans, it's the spending side of the ledger that makes them especially worry about deficits. Now, we've had enough lessons to know that not every tax cut pays for itself. But that's often been used, and to be honest, they revere investment and sort of that element of economic growth. Mm-hmm. And one of the things in 2017 they learned was if you give those tax breaks, not in rates necessarily, although they gave a lot of rate cuts, but if you give those in things like depreciation, you're influencing future investing as opposed to rates which go on old investments too. And so to get that growth from these things, another rat hole I'm down, but get the growth from these things, you have to kind of spin more of that tax cut over in that investment side
Sure.
of it so that the people get encouraged to do the new thing and not just live off the old thing. But they care, Capitol Hill has not become, it's become too political in so many ways. And so you care about deficits when it's your opponent wanting to do the thing, and you care less about it when it's the thing you want to do. And that's true of both parties these days to some extent. Our deficits are growing really big, but I'm not a believer in a balanced budget. I think deficits help you in some ways.
You're a Hamiltonian figure in that.
I kind of go into that mold, but I also think you can have too much debt, and it can burden you. As long as interest rates were low, didn't matter as much.
Sure.
But now that interest rates are going up, have gone up, it matters more because the part you're paying on that debt gets bigger because your interest rate gets
Sure.
bigger at this
Sure.
point. But so they each have their merits and demerits in my book on both sides about how you deal with deficits and how important they are.
So you mentioned George Herbert Walker Bush. Of course, elected in '88, became president in '89. He made a promise to the Republicans at the 1988 Republican National Convention, read my lips, no new taxes. But as those who know Bush's history, he had been something of a center-right Republican who was anti-deficit and did not believe deficits were a good thing to carry over, and agreed to tax increases, which did not make some on the in his own party, especially House Minority Whip Newt Gingrich, happy. What exactly was President Bush agreeing to, and what was your role on the staff, sort of implementing that from the House side?
I would say he was being reasonable and thoughtful. It's unfortunate that his staff allowed him to say those first words.
The campaign,
You know,
right.
you build your own base here. He made his own problem in some ways. Newt Gingrich wouldn't have liked it anyway, but it gave him a focus.
Sure, fair.
It's
something very something
there were
recorded.
Some things, there were some things Hillary Clinton said in her campaign she shouldn't have, that she's had to live with ever since too. But it was one of those situations. He should not have said it. But it really was. Every time when deficits get a little out of hand, you know, when Clinton was president, this is sort of what led to some of the things later. But when Clinton was president, we were decreasing debt, so much so that Alan Greenspan, the head of the Fed at the time, thought, "Oh my God, what will we, the Fed, be able to do with our monetary policy if we don't have some of this debt out there to play with, to have to deal with at that point?" And he endorsed George Bush tax cuts at that point.
So this would have been the 01.
Yeah, these would have been the early.
Excuse me. Well,
Yeah. 01.
It would have been 01.
Yeah,
That's
01 is right. So at that point, you kind of you went down the rat hole of probably like 81, doing more than you should have. Mm-hmm. And so what George Bush did was take back some of it again, just like Ronald Reagan had done. But nobody thinks about Ronald Reagan that way. That's just not, he was always on message. George Bush got himself off message and got himself in trouble. But that's all you're doing. It's, again, you're doing these reconciliation bills that you're creating a budget, and that budget decides both spending numbers and what's going to be our revenue this year.
Right.
And so you can assume more revenue, then the committees have to go in and find a way to raise that revenue. Mm-hmm. And so they're changing the tax code to do that, to bring in more revenue. And it was just one more step of that. But Newt Gingrich found a place to stand on his bully pulpit and challenge it. And, you know, in many ways challenging governing at that point. It was the beginning of a long path of that that we're still living with today.
So we've got the 80, 89 or 90, which is the budget, and that includes those tax changes that George H.W. got behind. And so was 93 with the omnibus reconciliation, the COBRA, that I think Al Gore had to cast the tie-breaking vote in the Senate. So what Clinton, the Clinton administration, and his Democratic allies in the Congress passed, was that significantly different than what George H.W. Bush had done, or is that sort of a continuity in the story that you're telling of just
I think all of those years of
black?
reconciliation bills, you might one year focus on insurance companies. You might, and I think that was maybe 84.
Spread the pain around.
You might, yeah. So I mean, the staff needs to have time to focus on whatever it is you're focusing on at that point. But no, it was all a continuum.
It was. And how this, talking about staff focuses from year to year, and you said that not everybody stays as long as you. Is this something that once you know what the priorities are, you bring in staff that specialize in those things, or is this everybody run to the Library of Congress and bone up on bonds?
Your staff on the committees. You don't have a very big staff, even in the majority. You might have 5 or 6.
Okay. So
and you probably have a specialist on international tax, somebody who's doing pensions, because nobody else wants to do pensions, and so they've got pensions.
Nobody wants to do
And you
pensions.
have all these other worlds of things. So you have one that's doing individual stuff probably, but you don't have even during the 86 Act, it was a really small, it never got more than like 6 people. But you have that Joint Committee on Taxation staff. And they have the specialist that they try to plan ahead. They have an accountant. They have 2 or 3 people doing international tax work. They have people in a lot of different things. So you pull that person in, but you also figure out who are good outside advisors. You might pull some professors in and just have them come sit and talk with you. You know, your favorite professor in law school may have been really smart on something. And over time, you can find trusted advisors that you might have come speak to the members. Or you do have hearings, and people bring up bright thoughts in the hearings. But as a staff, and generally during those years, during my prime years, the Treasury staff's working with you too. And the IRS staff is in there, and they're saying this doesn't work, and this is a tax shelter. And so they're bringing news to you that you're looking at at that point.
So you're a small group, but it's not like you go off to the, up on the mountain.
No,
it's 6 people who control the entire.
And if you're lucky,
schedule.
you've started ahead planning for something. You think next year, let's look at X, or the members want to look at Y, and so you've started ahead, and you're doing pamphlets for them, and you're drafting legislation that you can talk about with them. And members bring their own ideas to the table too.
And that's a good sort of technical question is how much, especially somebody like you who had years of experience with several different chairs, could you go to the chair and say, no, seriously, we have to do this?
Depends on the chair. Some yes, most of them yes is the answer. Sometimes you end up with somebody who wants to be in charge of it all, and you might never be able to influence
not
them.
Not a delegator.
Anyway. Yes, yeah, not a delegator. And they aren't necessarily tax experts, so sometimes you run awry of where you might want to go. But in the end, it's those members who are voting on it. You are just staff. You can bring your best ideas. You're trying to make them the best they can be. And that's the way you think about it, but you are that public servant.
Right, you weren't elected.
And you have to know how the members feel about things generally, and you try to make the best version of the thing you can within that general view of those members, and it generally works. There's some members you can say, the staff has this great idea, look at this, and they'll go, that's just what I wanted.
Right.
And sometimes it'll be, that's great, but politically we can't go there. Or, there are lots of different answers a chair can give you. But generally you're in the meetings with them, and you kind of know where their minds are. And you're working, they have personal staff. You're working with those people. So sometimes you're meeting with those people and coordinating back, is this something they'd be comfortable with as it's evolving. So it's never just you in a back room designing it. It's kind of a organic sort of a thing.
Right. So somebody like Dan Rostenkowski had this, he had a reputation of being sort of very, very tough, very, very, he came out of Chicago politics, machine politics. Was he somebody you could look at and say, no, but seriously,
he was my favorite boss ever. Will
I didn't want to ask that question.
Always, and I probably shouldn't say that.
No.
He wanted his epitaph to read, "Is it good law?" Are you telling me that that this is something we really need to do? You tell me why. He had a great street gut to things. Once in a while, it might be something that dealt with traders on the Chicago Board of Trade.
Oh, trade.
It might be something that dealt with something else that he understood his local politics of, and you might have to modify it some. But he was still trying to find the right answer.
Right.
He would. It was very interesting. He would take on his own politics if he understood why you were doing it, and what the abuse, if there was an abuse, there was at that point, and how you might deal with that thing. But yeah, he was great. He just, he's one of those. He was an adult. Mm-hmm. And so he didn't have to prove he was in charge. He was in charge.
Right.
He also was a great negotiator. There was one time when Bob Dole saved out 2 provisions in a conference, because one dealt with those traders, and one was something, I think, for oil and gas. Saved them out to pair them at the end. And Rostenkowski saw this coming, and when Bob Dole said, let's just pair these, Rostenkowski said, no, we'll just drop them both. Dole learned not to kind of bluff him through the way at that point. One of his very first lessons to me was, you need to care less than the person across the table cares. Because if you care so much, you're going to give away. You're not going to be able to defend your position. Correct. And so he had many of those life lessons that I have found to be true over time. He was a wonderful guy.
So in 1994, there's an election. What, and this is again sort of a personal question, a personal reflection and memory. What were your thoughts on election night when it became clear that you, somebody who had never worked in the minority before, there was going to be a new reality on January 3rd, 1995?
I was in the Caribbean.
Oh, no.
With a couple of staff friends from the staff. I got every little bottle we'd saved from the airplane.
Oh, no.
And I think I got snockered that night and dealt with it the next morning.
Oh.
I was unprepared for losing the House. I was prepared for losing my chairman. He had been under indictment for things he never stole from the taxpayers, but he was under indictment by a guy who wanted to become senator from Virginia, who was the prosecutor at the time, and so I expected him to lose in Chicago, but I didn't expect the Democrats to. I didn't expect the wave that was there.
Right.
But the next morning, I got on the phone and started prepping. I was going back in a day or two anyway. Started prepping to get rid of 60, 70, 80 staff members, help them find jobs. I mean, it was like downsizing a business at that point. Because the Republicans, in the majority, you got 2/3 of the staff.
Right.
The majority, you got 1/3. And the new chair who was coming in wanted half the staff total. So you're cutting down to 1/6 of what you'd had before. But it was difficult. It was difficult for the members. One of the reasons I stayed through that and became their trusted advisor in many ways was they didn't have Rusty anymore, and they'd loved him as their leader. My Democrats had really loved him as their leader. He gave them discipline and focus, and they knew what was expected. And he was
cover, because he took the flack.
He did. He took
them.
the flack. They trusted each other because of that. You know, he knew if they said yes, they stayed yes, and they knew he would protect them in every way. And so they had lost him, and in many ways they had lost their way. The Democrats in the House are learning the same lesson this time. It hadn't been 40 years, but it's difficult because Democrats, I have learned, in the end, want to govern. They're never going to speak with one voice. They're all going to think they have the best idea. You can't change their DNA. So they have to figure out, what is my role in the minority? Am I enabling people to do something that I don't like? Or am I helping govern? Where can I be in all of this? The debt limit's one of those things. They almost can't figure out how to be helpful without being hurtful in the thing. And the Democrats had the same kind of a reaction of how do we do this? How do we go forward? And it took us a while to get our sea legs, staff and members at that point. But they did. They figured it out. They figured out how to say what they were for, and to be for some things you could find common ground on. They've always wanted to find that kind of place in the middle that you can be. That's what they were used to doing. But sometimes the other side, and this can be true of Democrats too, don't want the middle. You know, the progressive Democrats in the House have had that issue with other Democrats these last 2 years in this last Congress of we don't understand yet that we have to get anything done. We have to compromise with our more conservative Democratic members, at least. It's the same challenge. So at the moment they're challenged, and in that year, in 95, after the 94 election, was really, really tough for them.
Who was the ranking member who came in to lead the Democrats on the committee?
It had been Sam Gibbons, and after him came Charlie Rangel from New York.
And Representative Rangel remained ranking and chair.
He did. He became a chair at some point when Democrats took over.
It had to have been
2007. Yeah.
Yeah.
You have dates better than I do. In my mind, it all just merges.
It's teamwork, Janice. It's teamwork. So I think you answered this question about how the Democrats, what their role in the minority was, which it sounds like the short answer is finding some ways to be agreeable and helpful on things that they could tolerate. Yes. In terms of now in terms of toleration, you had 95, 96, the government shutdowns and the budget standoffs. How did that impact Ways and Means and your work? The sort of, this is too simple, but it's the Gingrich versus Clinton. Gingrich had to go out the back of the plane.
Well, again, like George Bush, like H.W., he made too big a deal of that and harmed himself in that context and allowed them, they shut down the government only for a couple of days. It didn't last long at that point. Republicans were as Democrats were learning to be in the minority, Republicans were learning how to work as a team.
And it had been 4 decades, and
there
was nobody who had ever been.
Yeah, and everybody wasn't the rabble rouser that Newt Gingrich was.
Sure.
Those people now are gone, but you had people who had kind of worked together and all, and the other Republicans didn't want that. The rabble rousers didn't want that group to happen, so they had to function as a team, and that was difficult for them. But Clinton was also doing his welfare reform and the things that Democrats in the House really didn't like.
The era of big government is over.
And the triangulation that was going on.
The Dick Morris.
It was hard for them. I'm not certain I really felt those first couple of years that we found the way to deal with things, because it was coming at you from all sides, and you couldn't just sit down and discuss. The politics got in the way of the policy.
Mm-hmm. At what point, and we talked about this earlier in terms of regular order and centralization, at what point did the House leadership start clawing and pulling away authority from the committees and from Ways and Means?
Maybe Nancy Pelosi. Well, Gingrich did.
Gingrich was the beginning.
He was the beginning of that. He had developed his contract with America. He developed all these things, and that wasn't done through the committees necessarily. That was a kind of his broader view of things. So he began to pull it back. To pull it in to leadership, and everybody who followed him continued that. Democrats and Republicans, leaders like to be in control of things. But you also had both parties figuring out centralized messages more than they had done in the past. In the past, you ran regionally, and the president would have a big message, and you would try to amplify that message, whoever's running for president. But you didn't have all of these wordsmith shops all around, and giving the talking points of the day and those things. And that was part of leadership taking back. I think for Gingrich, he needed a united group doing the things he let them do, because he brought them out of the wilderness. He brought them that majority, and he could do that. Consequently, he had the power to do that. And the people who were the chairs kind of ceded some of that power. They weren't Rostenkowskis. They wanted to work with their leadership, and it was an evolution. It didn't all happen at once.
Right.
But today it is very much that. Pelosi was as perfect as that as anybody, of bringing that centralized power in, and she was good at it. She managed her caucus well. She knew just how far she could push them, and the committee chairs worked with her to try to do that. And if they were lucky, they'd be part of the policy making before it came out, before they'd work with her. But once in a while, they weren't close to her, and that didn't work.
It's almost like it's evolved into more of a parliamentary system where the leadership will give you this. There's a 3-line whip,
you find out how to do
it. You toe the line.
But if they're smart, the staffs have worked around and made the thing the leader sends down something you can do.
Right.
That was part of our job. Right. Without everybody knowing you're doing that job.
Right.
Because she doesn't necessarily like it, and your own leader does it because they want to be the ones doing this. But sometimes you're helping cushion and make, just kind of scrape some of the edges off that thing, so it's something you can achieve for them.
To try and find a silver lining somewhere. What was it like coming back into the majority? So you had been out.
Oh, that's hard too.
So there's a dozen years, and politically speaking, 1990. So we'll call it. I don't remember the congressional numbers, but 93 to 95 versus 07, 09, I mean, it's just a world of difference between the politics of the early 90s and the politics of post 9/11, post Iraq War America.
It takes you a while to get your sea legs when you go back into the majority. It for most of the time, I think it's been true in these last few changes. The party that's been out of power has done some kind of a plan that they've used in the campaign. And it helps if you have a president of your party that's in office at that point, because then you have a better chance of accomplishing things. And you also have a better chance of having an agenda that's shared at that point. But so generally your first few months, you've kind of planned some things to do. And just as the Republicans today are. But you're literally getting your sea legs. You're literally, for them, the big test is going to be the debt limit. For other Congresses, that first big test has been something else. It also depends, some of these years you had the Senate in Republican hands and the House in Democratic hands, and at that point you're just messaging. You're trying to do the appropriation bills and survive the year, and sometimes that's what you step back, and your agenda becomes a much smaller agenda of what is achievable.
Right.
What do we need to do to please our own base and pass some legislation? I mean, you're seeing it play out this Congress with the Republicans in the House figuring out if they can get those sea legs, and having their tests come up to see.
And then sometimes external events impose the housing crash, 9/11. So the 9/11 sort of influence, not necessarily induced recession, because they may have already been going on.
But the housing stuff, the bubbles. I was in the room the day that Secretary Paulson came to visit Pelosi and the leadership.
Did he really get down on his knee?
He would have done anything at that point. It was a sobering experience. She'd been looking for him. Lehman Brothers had just fallen.
Right.
And the economy was teetering, and it really was, you need to act in the next couple of days for us to handle this. And it was one of those times where people in the room rose to that occasion.
And this would have been after the first vote failed.
Yes.
And that he needed the Democrats to carry the water.
Yeah,
basically.
This was the end of the Bush administration.
Right.
Almost the beginning of the Obama administration. And you needed to infuse lots of money in lots of places. Housing was a piece of that, a very big piece of that, come crashing down at this point. And, you did a bill that was almost $1 trillion. I look back on it, and it probably should have been bigger, but that was the lesson. This last stuff may have been too big, because the lesson you learned was it wasn't big enough the time before. But yeah, it was just sort of sobering. But yeah, those outside events, that was one of the most powerful. Right. But there are other times, the savings and loan crisis.
Oh yeah,
led to legislation on that. And those times, people generally will stand up and work together when it's a crisis.
Right.
When it's not a crisis, it's harder to get people to cross those political lines that are farther apart. You don't have many people in the middle these days. You have the progressives, you have the very conservatives, and you have a few odd creatures out there trying to find their home.
The Kirsten Sinemas and the Joe Manchins and the Lisa Murkowskis and
they
Susan
help
Collins.
get things done. Neither edge loves them for it, though. And they don't have a lot of company. They had enough company on the Inflation Reduction Act last year to get the Democrats stuck together, even though they held their nose on a few things and wanted some things they didn't get. But
carried
they
interest
rose to that too. Yeah.
Now, this may be a question you can't answer, but it's skipping ahead. But this would have been an Inflation Reduction Act, so 2022. Yeah. Did you offer any insights into the crafting of that legislation, even though you were outside of government? Do those in power still seek out your counsel, Janice?
Yes and no. Quite honestly, Republicans are better at that than Democrats are, in that context, because for them, when you're on the outside, it's just kind of business as usual, and they share information in that context. But there were some things that a lot of the staff up there were still my staff, had been worked under me. So there are a few things that they asked about, and for what it was worth, I gave my advice on. But and some of the things were things we had worked on. They just kind of came to fruition in that legislation.
Because when you lose,
you have a pantry of ideas that remain after you. That if something has been drafted and scored and analyzed, becomes part of the ether. And sometimes you open that pantry door and say, this is just the thing I need to make this thing over here work. And it's one of the reasons why people should always look at legislation that's introduced, even though it's not making it anywhere this time. It may come back. It may come back. So there is some of that. I still have a good relationship with the staffs on the Hill. And I am a registered lobbyist on a couple of things, not very much. I try to limit my lobbying to things that are pretty universal. And at Price, where I work at PricewaterhouseCoopers, that's necessary anyway, because when you have this many clients, you have a conflict of interest on almost anything that's narrow.
I see.
So if you find kind of a broader issue that Democrats and Republicans want to get done, then that might fit.
As long as you shoot the moon, you can do anything.
Right? Most of the time, my work is advising others on how to go up and talk too.
So going back to 2010, that's another shellacking, as President Obama said at the time, a wave election that meant you and your staff once again back into the minority.
That was right after health care, right?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. You're right. Health care had gotten done over several months, and Paul Ryan from Wisconsin comes in as the chair. Charlie Rangel, I believe, goes back as ranking member. And that's the way it stayed. And well, I suppose Ryan moved up to speaker in 2014 or 15. But what was it that the Democrats were hoping to do during that second, the middle of Obama's first term through his
survive?
second term?
Kind of my one word. There was some nervousness about Ryan. Personally, they really liked him, but he had served as the budget chair before he came back to be the chair.
And he had lots of ideas.
He did have lots of ideas, some of which they liked, some of which they didn't like. I think their main goal was to keep him from achieving those ideas that they didn't want as such. In the end, you really didn't do big things until he moved over to be speaker after Boehner had to leave, having many of the same issues that McCarthy has today.
Exactly.
In that kind of, the Tea Party had come in at that point. And Boehner had hoped to actually give power back to committees. He'd been Education Committee. That's
he talked about that in his memoir.
He had wanted to do that, and he clearly, and Ryan expected that.
Right.
That was what Ryan, and it didn't happen because that caucus wouldn't allow it to happen. But for Democrats, I think they were trying to keep some of Ryan's ideas. I don't even know as much of it was tax at that point, but Social Security and unemployment compensation, a lot of the entitlement kinds of issues. In taxes, Ryan was an acolyte of, oh Lord, I just had it in my brain, of the football player.
Jack Kemp.
Jack Kemp. And so he loved tax credits and things. So there were some places they could find things in common from that. But he often chose them for things that Democrats would have preferred tax credits for other things instead. But no, I think at that point, again, you're picking survival. You're counting on the president. You're sort of, when you're in the minority and the president's of your party,
right,
you kind of let the president set the agenda to some extent. So for them, it was take a step back and do things in that context.
What role did Ways and Means play in the debt ceiling standoffs of the Obama years?
Not as big as I thought it always should have been. It is the jurisdiction of the committee. But the committee gave away its power at one point by having what was called the Gebhardt rule. There were many Gebhardt rules, but this one said if you're doing a budget resolution, you put the new debt number into the budget resolution, then when the House and Senate agree to that, that number jumps out, goes to the Senate as a bill, and the Senate has to agree to it. So the House never has to vote on it separately.
Right.
It got you out of lots of trouble. But most of the time, when you're dealing with a debt limit like that, it's more the president making the thing happen and the Treasury Department dealing with whoever's recalcitrant. And by that point, it had become the leaders. The Ways and Means Committee doesn't always even get a seat at the table. It may have a seat at the kiddie table shouting advice over kind of meeting with its leader, meeting with the Democratic leader for the Democrats, Republican leader in the House for the, so you have some influence. But these are the big issues.
And again, really this is a product, and stop me if I'm speaking for you, but this is a product of centralization, of pulling it away, the authority away from the committees.
Long ago, the committee just did this, and the House passed it, and the Senate passed it. But that just got harder and harder as it became a political tool. It became a hostage for taking for whatever the issue was you wanted, and it never was that before. People they knew they had to act on the debt limit. They acted on the debt limit, both sides. It was not a partisan battle at all.
It seems like with centralization that you can either, and correct me if I'm wrong, force through major legislation like the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017, or it makes it impossible to do.
I think that is correct. And what you have consequently is volatility in the tax code. Because if one party does its version when they're in charge of everything, and you have nothing while they're mixed, then the other party gets in charge, they do the opposite thing they can do. And for business, well, for individuals too, but for business in the country, it's how do I do my long-range planning?
Right, how can you do macro level?
You can't. Yep. And our next version of that will be 2025.
What's 2025?
2025 is when
something else to look forward to.
Almost all of the individual tax cuts from 2017 expire at the end of 2025. Remember, reconciliation, generally it lasts 10 years these days. One of the rules of reconciliation is you can't increase the deficit in those out years. So what the Republicans did in 2017, they wanted to keep two things permanent. They wanted the corporate rate down
which was dropped to 25?
No, 22. 22. And they wanted to keep their international pieces in place. So they let all the individual cuts expire, and they let some business things, those business things I was talking about earlier, those also got tougher, kind of because revenue has a tail to it. It doesn't all just stop suddenly. Those had to stop earlier so that tail could die out by the end of the 10 years. So the increases that were in that 2017 legislation could keep paying for the rate cuts. So a lot of the business tougheners and some of the other things stayed permanent, but you had to get rid of the individual tax cuts to keep enough revenue flowing beyond, so it didn't blow the rule. So in 2025, we're going to have a tax bill. It's going to be a major tax bill. And what you've seen, if you've watched the minutia over these last few years, and most people haven't, is when things are expiring, they get tossed into 2025. So it's going to be a big fiscal cliff battle like these others, and it's going to be the next big one. I think these 2 years, if you do some small things, that'll be what they're able to do. But you'll find probably next year, when the Republicans have their sea legs, the House will be passing a bill to say, make all those things permanent. That's our message. It won't pass the Senate, but we're sending a message, elect us, you're going to get to keep all these tax cuts. And Democrats will be having to figure out what's their message going forward. What's that going to be? But you don't know who's in charge in 2025. So it's kind of a jump ball. So that's why all these things get tossed into it. You know, your guy may be in charge, somebody else's guy may be in charge, but it's a jump ball, so you have your chance at it. So 2025 is your next time.
Well, that is something to look forward to. And Janice, I know you need to get out of here. You've got other more important, pressing matters this evening. So I wanted to finish up. Folks who are thinking about following your path, that you just happened to, that fate, happened upon you. What would your advice be to younger folks, college folks, grad students, law school students who are contemplating a life and career like you in public service, either on Capitol Hill or in government at some other level?
I still believe in it. I'm lucky enough to get to talk to some of the law school classes that have a session up here, both from Georgia and from other places. And they choose to come to Washington because they're thinking that way. And we need that. We need new, thoughtful people to come in government at whatever level. You don't have the world of bipartisanship that I had, and I regret that. But even on the Hill, there are places. There is the Library of Congress, you mentioned that earlier, where one can help the members understand what the rules are. There is the Legislative Counsel's Office, which do the drafting, the statutory drafting, a very important thing, and they're just brilliant people who work there that are able to put a general rule and an exceptions and a ABC together and think logically in that context. There are a few committees on the Hill that are bipartisan. Armed Services still, half Democrats, half Republicans. Over in the Senate, you've got a few more that are. So there's some places you can go that all of this rhetoric that's in the air all the time doesn't get in the way. You can work for your individual congressperson if you think that. You can work in the administration. You know, there's a judicial direction to go. There are lots of things. There are also advocacy groups in Washington. Some I think are very thoughtful. Some are more partisan and kind of open in that partisanship. But there are lots of different levels of things one can do. State government.
Sure.
Just working it. We're not going to function well going forward if thoughtful people don't join when they're young and work through. Unfortunately, government service is sort of pejorative these days. Not only elected officials, but you've been there too long. But it takes you a while to learn what you're doing. And if your attitude is, I want to serve people and make the world slightly better or not let it get worse or whatever it is, my advice is try it. See if you can make it work.
Well, thank you very much, and I think that's a good message. We need those thoughtful people because 2025 is right around the corner.
And other issues. We've got plenty of issues coming.
Sure. Janice Mays, thank you so much on behalf of the Russell Library, and just thank you so much for sharing your experience, your 4 decades of experience.
I was a lucky person. I've been blessed. I've been blessed to do that. I'm blessed now to try to help business understand it. So I'm a lucky person.
Well, we're very lucky for having you explain it to us today. So thank you so much.
Thank you.